Welcome to our midweek Bible study where we're always looking to discover more facets of believers in the end time as we're covering different letters of the Brit Hadashah, that is the New Testament, emphasizing the believer's behavior, conduct, and actions during this period leading to the rapture. Now, reading Paul in the book of Romans and seeing with which zeal and fervor and eagerness he defends the faith, one realizes that the Church of God was in a very peculiar and fragile position at the beginning. We can think of Paul with other believers being in a small raft, going against a strong current, struggling to keep a straight line and constantly emptying the waters coming from all sides. But they were warned. As we are, in the parables of the kingdom of heaven, Jesus made sure that one understands the struggles of the church in this world. In the parable of the soils, he told us that only one out of 4 soils will properly respond to the word. What of the other 3/4? Well, these are a mixed group of believers and unbelievers. We see them in the same raft, not helping at all. In the second parable, these extra weights are called the tare. That is the false believers who have this mission but to weigh down and sink that raft. Not only that, Jesus gives a third parable, the parable of the mustard seed, and tells us that since these tares are not to be able to destroy the good seed from within, it will multiply within it. And furthermore, Jesus adds another parable. Shalom, shalom, and welcome to our midweek Bible study where we're always looking to discover more facets of our great and wonderful God. This Bible study is titled The Believers in the End Time as we're covering different letters of the Brit Hadashah, that is the New Testament, emphasizing the believer's behavior, conduct, and actions during this period leading to the rapture. Now, reading Paul in the book of Romans and seeing with which zeal and fervor and eagerness he defends the faith, one realizes that the Church of God was in a very peculiar and fragile position at the beginning. We can think of Paul with other believers being in a small raft, going against a strong current, struggling to keep a straight line and constantly emptying the waters coming from all sides. But they were warned. As we are, in the parables of the kingdom of heaven, Jesus made sure that one understands the struggles of the church in this world. In the parable of the soils, he told us that only one out of 4 soils will properly respond to the word. What of the other 3/4? Well, these are a mixed group of believers and unbelievers. We see them in the same raft, not helping at all. In the second parable, these extra weights are called the tare. That is the false believers who have this mission but to weigh down and sink that raft. Not only that, Jesus gives a third parable, the parable of the mustard seed, and tells us that since these tares are not to be able to destroy the good seed from within, it will multiply within it. And furthermore, Jesus adds another parable and warns the good seed that while the evil one develops side religions and to confound man, he at the same time will put leaven, that is false doctrines, within the Church of God. This, you see it in the 4th parable of the woman with the leaven. In normal circumstances, the raft would have sunk, but it does not sink. Considering all these things, one marvels at God's work within the congregations of the Messiah. The existence of the body of Jesus, of the Messiah, is a true miracle, as it is the object of incessant attempt to pull it down, While it is surrounded with so many obstacles within and without, what clearly comes out of her is what we read in 1 John 4:4.
You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world.
You see, the wrath will never sink. It is like Noah's ark or Noah's barge, if you want, because this is what it was. While shaken from all sides, it stays afloat while all other things went under water. This is what will happen at the end. And this intensity and this struggle is very well portrayed in the passage we're about to study today in the book of Romans. In his struggle to teach and protect those congregations that God entrusted to him, Paul is seen here endowed with an untiring zeal in defending the faith. Now we are in chapter 2, and by the end of this chapter, we see that Paul had already exposed the sins of the nations. He also dealt with the so-called open-minded group of people in the congregation in Rome who were ready to accept sin within their own congregation. After that, he strongly scolded another group of people, that is a group of Messianic Jews, who wanted these congregations to adopt the Mosaic law. These were the Judaizers. Now, who were these people, the Judaizers? They were a mixed group of Jews and Gentiles who were trying to appear more spiritual than others by becoming circumcised and asking believers to be circumcised and to follow the law. The Jewish element of this group would have been the one who constituted the sect of the Pharisees within the Church of God and these people had difficulties going from one dispensation of the law and to grace. No, many are surprised to see or to hear of such a group within Christianity, but they're mentioned actually in Acts chapter 15, verse 5, where they did cause actually many problems at the beginning until they matured up. The other group of Gentile Judaizers were from the nations who did not quite understand the passage from the law to grace and perhaps were so enamored with the Jewish culture that they were swayed in believing that they needed, among other things, to be circumcised to be saved. These two groups are still in existence today. There are a few sects of Messianic Judaism and Messianic congregations that have returned to the law today, or more precisely to rabbinical Judaism, and teach others, Jews and Gentiles, to abide by their laws. Perhaps few realize that they are not going back to the Mosaic law, but to rabbinical Judaism. Only a few can make this distinction between the biblical Judaism and rabbinical Judaism. And at the time of Paul, these were so disturbing that they were doing is the exact opposite than what the Jew is called to do. Instead of bringing the word of God to the Gentiles, they were bringing legalism and austerity. Paul even boldly quoted Isaiah 52:5 in Romans 2:24, when he says, "The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." That is a bold statement Paul is saying here. Again, as for the Gentile elements in the Messianic Judaism, a strange thing actually is happening here in North America. We find many Messianic congregations which look like rabbinic synagogues, and where there are a few Jews in attendance, and often there are no Jews at all. However, while they are believers within these groups, these have become a niche, that is, for the growth of the tare. And there is one other major problem that these Judaizers created and do create within the churches even today, is a separation between Gentiles and Jews, and further generated and deepened this growing anti-Jewish feeling among many. Paul deals with this problem, especially here in this section of Romans. Paul counteracts these things in many ways. A first teaching he develops is that of salvation by faith and not by works. He makes a point of distinction between belief that is from the heart as opposed to formalism and outward appearances. And we find them in this letter just like the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures, as they were also fighting many fronts. the priests they were fighting, the false prophets, even the kings, and they had one thing in mind, that is to proclaim the word of God. And so does Paul here. So Paul was fighting those Gentiles and Jews who disturbed the growth of the congregations, and it seems that this was his greatest fight, really. You know, at the end of his life, he sums up his fight and mentions different dangers that he had to confront. In 2 Corinthians 11:26, he speaks of dangers from the rivers, from the robbers, from the Gentiles, from the Jews, and so on. But notice the last one, dangers from among false brethren. Something that must have affected him, and which he puts in the same line as though the dangers against his life. And all of this stems from his deep love for the Word of God. This we can see it in the way he speaks in Romans 2:16. Look at this verse.
On the day when, according to my gospel, God will judge the secrets of men through Yeshua, the Messiah.
What's so special about this verse? See how he speaks of the scriptures. My gospel, he says. This could be seen as a testimony of his great love for the word, which he was seeing being trampled down by false teachings and unnecessary additions. For Paul did not come to bring a new gospel. On the contrary, he came to establish the gospel of the Messiah and the gospel of God, as he mentions the word gospel actually 10 times in this letter, and fully espouses it by calling it my gospel. And in so doing, he will bring out many fundamental doctrines that we find in the scriptures. Let me tell you a story. Have you ever heard of Aaron the tailor? Because of his reputation, an influential entrepreneur visiting a city ordered a tailor-made suit. But when he came to pick up his suit, the customer found that one sleeve twisted that way and the other one the other way, one shoulder bulged out and the other caved in. So he, being a very nice guy, pulled and managed to make his body fit actually the suit. As he returned home on the bus, another passenger noticed his odd appearance and asked if Aaron the tailor had made the suit. And he said, yes, but how do you know? The man answered. Amazing, the other one said. I knew that Aaron was a good tailor, but I had no idea he could make a suit fit so perfectly someone as deformed as you. This is actually precisely what Paul wanted to save the church from, adopting itself to false teaching and additions of different legends, but have it fit to the gospel of the Messiah. So Paul addresses these tailors in Romans chapter 2, verses 17 to 24. With these verses, that is, Paul starts his teaching on salvation. What is salvation? How is it linked to holiness, with election, with religion? Here he addresses and confronts head-on the Judaizers, and begins in verse 17 by saying, but if you bear the name of Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God, and he goes on to scold him, once again today's readers might see himself as a spectator. Doesn't that speak to the Jews only? More than that, Paul is speaking of the many types of Judaizers present in the godly congregations, such as religious legalists, religious formalists. Once again, as we saw in the Old Testament, Israel is seen as an example for who man is. These are like a second Adam to the Gentiles. Now, it is not in the scope of this study to go verse by verse, but there are a few important passages and principles that Paul lays out for us in this chapter that I want to bring to you. A powerful one is in verse 9. See what it says.
There will be tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Gentiles.
They are like a second Adam to the Gentiles. And so what Paul does is, on the one hand, scolds Judaizers, but he also brings back Israel to her proper place. Now, it is not in the scope of this study to go verse by verse, but there are a few important passages and principles that Paul lays out for us in this chapter. Many have to do with Israel. A powerful one is verse 9. See what it says.
There will be tribulation and distress for every soul of man who does evil, of the Jew first, and also of the Gentiles.
Now, this is a principle we find throughout history and especially these last days. Take, for instance, World War II. While over 50 million people died during this war, a great wave of anti-Semitism had preceded this war, and where 6 million Jews actually were killed. The Jewish people are like the canary in a coal mine. It is the first one to detect gas and warns the workers to flee the mine. So anti-Semitism that is can be seen as a warning of great world instability, and the Jews are the first to tell us about these things, their conditions, the growing anti-Semitism. And so today's anti-Semitisms, tribulations, and persecution of the Jewish people in Israel and in the diaspora concerns all the nations of the world and all individuals, as they are warning us of things to come. Romans 2:9 then tells us that what we're seeing today are signs and warnings very similar to the ones seen in the past history, where the world seeks a scapegoat for its problem, and Israel happens to be the one and accused of the planet's problem. However, this is only half the principle, for the rest of the principle is found in the next verse, verse 10. See what it says.
But glory and honor and peace to everyone who does good, to the Jew first and also to the Gentiles.
Eventually, and at the second coming of Yeshua, Jews from all over the world will be gathered by God, brought back to their land, and there will be peace and harmony. The principle follows the Hebrew Scriptures prophet's prediction of the millennium, or that is the Messianic age, and unto the eternal state, where the Apostle John tells us that the names of the 12 tribes of Israel will be engraved on the 12 gates of heaven, and this is such a great glory and honor given to this nation for eternity. This principle also reminds us that Israel is God's prophetic clock for tribulation, war, and persecution. And in dealing with the law and grace, Paul gives us another very good argument against those who were pushing the law. This is found in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15.
For when Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written on their hearts, their conscience bearing witness, and their thoughts alternately accusing or else defending them.
Now, that's a very important statement. How can the Gentiles fulfill the law without having the law? And which law was being referred to here? According to the context of Romans 2, it is the Mosaic law. If so, how can Gentiles fulfill the Mosaic law without being under or even knowing the law itself? Obviously, there's something higher than the mere commandments of the law itself. That is the spirit of the law which we ought to seek in every commandment. As for the Mosaic law with its 613 commandments, we know that it was given to Israel, but by itself it cannot represent the whole law of the Lord, because some have fulfilled it without having the Mosaic law. This means that the law of the Lord was there before, parallel, and after the Mosaic law. Being a law of God, according to James, Paul, and David, the Mosaic law is holy and good, but as a system. We understand from Galatians 3:19 that it was added at some point in time. This is actually what the verse says.
What purpose then does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator.
If it was added, to what was it added? To the already existing law of the Lord. These things that are added are the ceremonies, that is, the sacrifices, the temple worship, and especially the judgment. All of these serve as a training ground for Israel, and as our training ground as well when we study these things, because we realize the importance of sin and the importance of what Yeshua did for us. As for the judgments, again, the system of the Mosaic law was given so that the Jew realizes his shortcomings, that he is a sinner and he must depend entirely on God, and today it still serves this purpose for it is still again the word of God. This is what Paul explains when he says in Romans 7:7, for I would not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. One of the purposes of the law, again, is to bring out sin so we can deal with sin in our life. There is another passage that is important in this text, one that many use to attempt to show that Israel has been replaced by the church. You must have heard it before. We have dealt with it before, but listen to it again. It's in verses 28 to 29.
For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God.
First, let's see what this passage does not teach. What it does not teach is that Gentiles become Jews or become spiritual Jews. By definition, a Jew is a people, not a faith. While one may convert to rabbinical Judaism, but one cannot become a Jew, for one cannot change his or her ancestry. So Paul is making this distinction between Jews within the Jewish people. This is not a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, nor between Israel and the church, but between the remnant of Israel and the non-remnant of Israel, between the Jewish believers and the Jewish unbelievers. Right? Now, in the line of thought, we can also say, by the way, for he is not a Christian who is one outwardly, but he is a Christian who is one inwardly. And this is in line with what the Lord taught about the wheat and the tare. He himself said at the end, as we read in Matthew 7, verses 21-23, that at the end,
many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.
Here the Lord is not making a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, for instance. He's making a distinction between Christians who say they are Christians but are not, and genuine Christians who believe in the Word of God. In the same way, Paul speaks of the inward and outward Jew, making a distinction between believing Jews and the remnant of Israel and the other Jews. These distinctions help us not to be too impressed by the size and beauty of a building, of a religion itself, but to look deeper into the people and how they reflect the teaching of the gospel of the Messiah. Let us now move into chapter 3, because the argument follows in there. After speaking so harshly about the Judaizers, and in case one would generalize to all Jews, something that has been done and is being done today, here in chapter 3, Paul begins to bring Israel back again to its proper place. Here in chapter 3, verse 1, he reminds us that the Bible did not stop at Romans 2:24, which accuses the Judaizers to blaspheme the name of God among the Gentiles. And so he starts by saying in verse 1, what advantage then has the Jew? Well, if one follows the train of thoughts of many, the answer would have been, well, not so much at all. Look, they forsook Jesus and they are lost. It looks like they are rejected by God and they are punished for their rejection of Jesus. What then is there left as an advantage? Well, this is where Paul comes in and answers the questions. His answer must have surprised many, even today. See what he says. What advantage then has the Jew? Much in every way, or great in every respect. I want to tell you, this is a lot. There are great advantages of being Jewish as far as Paul is concerned. As if Paul was saying, yes, I scolded them, but they're still God's people. And here he enumerates only one advantage in chapter 3. And here, that one advantage that he enumerates is right to the point. See what he says as he finishes his sentence in verse 2. He says, first of all, because of them were committed the oracles of God. What he tells them here is that God spoke through them, and not only the whole of the Old Testament was written by Jews, but the whole of the New Testament as well was written by them. This is a great advantage. And by the way, I would include Luke as well, and I'll explain this later on. What is brought out here is also the Jewish covenant position. The Jews are still God's people, and God's promises to the Jews are not yet fulfilled. So it is as if Paul says, it is not because I scolded a few Jews that the whole of Israel has been rejected. Yes, some have gone astray. But what he seems to ask now is, why do you generalize? It is true that the Gentiles have become partakers of Jewish spiritual blessings, but they have not become partakers of Jewish physical and material blessings as listed in the Abrahamic covenant. They are still privileges to being a Jew. Notice again how Paul begins in verse 2 with the word first of all, which leads us to believe that there are second, there are third, and more promises. But where's the rest of the list? The rest of the list is found in Romans chapter 9, verses 4 to 5. This section of the New Testament that deals with Israel, past, present, and future. You know that in between Romans chapter 3 and Romans chapter 9, Paul deals mainly about the justification in Yeshua, our victory over sin, our assurance of salvation, and then he resumes his arguments for Israel. While the word Jew or Israel does not appear in between Romans chapter 9 and chapter 3, but we find it repeated many times, in these passages of Romans 9 to 11. So what are these advantages? We will look at them next time we meet. We're going to go through Romans chapter 9, verses 1 to verse 5, and see the advantages for Israel today. May the Lord greatly bless you.